Well, hello, Confirmands. Thank you for joining me. This is year 2, the life of Christ, and this is lesson 22. Today we're going to be talking about the miracles that Jesus did raising the dead. And there are 3 of them that we're going to be looking at. Just a reminder that we are in our Lenten schedule. It's on the back of your syllabus that we gave you at the start of the year. Here's what you need to know. We are at peace this week. So March 22nd, we are at peace. The soup stopper starts at 5:30. You should come to that. It's good. The in-person confirmation group starts at 6:30. Lenten worship starts at 7. And online confirmation discussion starts at 8. Just another reminder that the Thursday night service is going on at Nelsonville. It starts at 6:45 with the music, and then the worship time starts at 7. If you come to the Thursday night service during Lent, you get double worship credit. And some of you are kind of far behind in your worship attendance. And so this is a way to catch up. The reason we're doing it is we want to expose you and your family to this Thursday night service. It's a time of peace. It's a time of meditation. It's a time of quiet. The music is outstanding. And it would be good to see you there. Communion is offered every week on Thursday nights. So there's no reason for you to have big spaces between your attendance at the Lord's table. All right. Again, we're talking about raising the dead. So let's start with the first part of our phrase that pays tonight. I'll trust in God's unchanging word. I'll trust in God's unchanging word. All right. Now, maybe the best way to think about life and death, the world of the living and the world of the dead, is that both of those are rooms in God's house. Just like in your house where you live, there's a kitchen and then there's, a living room or a family room or a dining room next to it. I mean, I don't know your house, but there's some room next to the kitchen, right? And when someone is in the kitchen, they're in the house. And when someone moves to the dining room or the family room or wherever that next room is, they're not obliterated, right? They don't cease to exist. They don't evaporate into a cloud of atoms, right? That they're in that next room. Right? And sometimes, depending on how a house is constructed, that next room may be kind of hard. It may be really hard to communicate between the 2 rooms. That there are rooms in my house that are adjacent to each other, but it's hard to hear when someone is talking to you or about you, I guess. It's hard to hear because there's not a direct line of sight, and it's hard, you don't know what's going on in that other room. But you would never say that those 2 rooms are not in the same house. You would never say that people in those rooms had ceased to exist, just that sometimes people are in one of the rooms and sometimes they're in the other. So for me, that's a really helpful way to think about the world of the living and the world of the dead. That right now we are in a room in God's house. That this world is a room in God's house. And I don't know how many rooms are in God's house. I don't know how many other places that God keeps some of God's creation. I don't know that. But we believe that when you die, when you leave this world, you walk through a door into another room in God's house. That you don't evaporate, right? Your body will decompose, right? Waiting for the resurrection, but your spirit, everything that makes you who you are will simply have moved to another room in God's house. And for the most part, there's no communication between those 2 rooms. But they're in God's house and they're filled with people who are beloved by God. And you and I will one day step into that other room, unless Jesus comes while we're still alive. But we'll step into that other room and we'll be reunited with everyone who's gone before. So when someone dies, when a Christian dies, we're sad. I mean, we're very sad that we won't enjoy their company, that things that we wanted to say to them, we aren't going to be able to say for a while. If we needed to forgive them, it's particularly painful, or if we needed them to forgive us. I mean, these are really painful things, but I don't want you to not have any hope like pagans do, like people who are not Christians. I don't want you to be without hope. That those that you have commended to God's arms, Christians who've died, they're still in the house of God, and they're still under the shelter of God's care. And one of the ways that we know that is that there's these stories in the Bible that it wasn't just Jesus who came back to life, but Jesus was able to pull 3 people, out of the family room and back into the kitchen, right? Out of the dining room and back into the kitchen. See, they're still alive. They still exist. They are still who they are, right? And then they went on to live the balance of their life, in this world, and then they died and they went back to to the room in God's house that houses the dead. So I don't want you to be without hope. And when you go to funerals, I want your sadness to be tempered with faith and with hope and with joy that the person you love still lives in God's house, in God's kingdom. All right? Okay, so the first story is from Mark chapter 5. Now, when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue named Jairus came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet, and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live." So he went with him. And a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She'd heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, for she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it, but the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." And while he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And when they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to him, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside, and he took the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. So it is a very cool story. Structurally, I want you to see that there's at the top and at the bottom, there's this story of healing or of bringing back to life Jairus' daughter, and in the middle, there's this story about the woman being healed of hemorrhages. Right? It's called an inclusio. It's like a picture frame. That the picture and the frame, they're supposed to speak together. They're supposed to work together to give you a different sense of the story, a different fullness of the story than you can have just alone with, if you just did the one story and then the other. So this way of sandwiching a story between two halves of another story is done deliberately, and it's supposed to help you understand more fully. So there's just all kinds of cool stuff in this, right? That the ruler of the synagogue, he's not supposed to be asking Jesus for help, but desperation makes him reach out to Jesus. This woman who doctors have been unable to heal thinks if she just touches Jesus' clothes, she'll be made well. That's in fact what happens. And Jesus feels the power go out of his body. If you don't have questions about that, you're not paying attention, right? And then, while Jesus is healing this woman, you can imagine that Jairus is just tap dancing, that he's got to be just crazy with anxiety. My daughter is dying. This woman's been sick for 12 years, right? She can wait. Come on. And his worst nightmare happens, that while Jesus is, dealing with this woman who didn't have to be healed today, his little girl dies. We got stuff here about mourning customs, that people are outside the house screaming and wailing. And when Jesus tells them that the girl's not dead but asleep, they laugh at him because they know dead. They're professional mourners, right? They know what dead looks like. And if you have ever been in the presence of a person as they die, dead looks different than sleeping, right? But Jesus takes mom and dad and his 3 disciples in. He doesn't do any magic dances. He doesn't pour magic potions on her. There's no specialized wand movement like in Harry Potter, right? He just says, "Little girl, get up," and she does. Right? Again, someone being brought back from the family room into the kitchen, so that you know that both the living and the dead are in God's house, and you know that Jesus has authority in God's house to move people back and forth between the rooms. All right, next part of the phrase that pays, till soul and body sever. Till, like until, but till soul and body sever. You probably want to throw a period on the end of that. All right, from Luke 7. Soon afterwards, Jesus went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went with him. As he approached the gate of the town, a man who had died was being carried out. He was his mother's only son, and she was a widow, and with her was a large group from the town. When the Lord saw her, he had compassion for her and said to her, "Do not weep." Then he came forward and touched the bier, and the bearer stood still. He said to him, "Young man, I say to you, rise." The dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. Fear seized them all, I guess, and they glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has risen among us, and God has looked favorably on his people." The word about him spread throughout Judea and all the surrounding country. So there's just a lot going on here. This woman has lost her son, and she's lost her husband. She's alone. She has no means of support, right? And so Jesus has compassion on her, right? Sometimes we think that if Jesus had compassion, the compassion would be for the dead person, right? I mean, that's the person who's really lost everything. No, that person hasn't lost everything. They moved from the kitchen to the dining room. They've lost nothing. They still are who they are. Right? They still are who they've always been. But this woman is in real trouble. She's lost her husband. She's lost her son. She has no one to provide for her. She is really in trouble. Jesus has compassion on her. He touches this dead body. You're not supposed to do that, right? It's supposed to be polluting to you, that if you touch a dead body, you can't go to temple for 7 days because you're polluted. Jesus doesn't get polluted by the dead body. Jesus' strength flows in to the dead body, right? There's something there for you, right? That Jesus isn't polluted by your sins. Jesus sets you free. Your power, or Jesus' power, flows into you for the forgiveness of your sins, for the amendment of your life. So, and again, there's no big formula, right? It's as simple as you saying to someone in the dining room, "Hey, step into the kitchen," right? Jesus says, "Young man, I say to you, rise." And he sits up and begins to talk. And then this next part is the part that makes me believe it's true, right? People don't say, "Well, that's really cool," and go have some mac and cheese, right? They are terrified. I mean, you've been to a funeral by this point in your life. Imagine if someone touched the coffin and said, "Young man, I tell you, rise." And the dead person sat up and began to talk. Right? People would be screaming. People would leave vapor trails as they left the sanctuary at a full run, right? It's terrifying to us because we haven't thought enough about the living and the dead both being in different rooms in God's house. All right. Next line of the phrase that pays, for though all things pass away, comma, for though all things pass away, comma. All right, now here's a very long story. It's about 5% of the total length of John's Gospel, right, from John 11. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was ill, so the sisters sent a message to Jesus, Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, this illness does not lead to death, rather it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Accordingly, though Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, after having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. See, I mean, he's just not worried about it. He's in charge of both of these rooms in God's house, right? And there's something there, you know, this illness is for God's glory, okay? Then, after this, he said to the disciples, let us go to Judea again. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were just now trying to stone you, and you're going there again? Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours of daylight? Those who walk during the day do not stumble because they see the light of this world, but those who walk at night stumble because the light is not in them. After saying this, he told them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going there to awaken him. The disciples said to him, Lord, if he's fallen asleep, he'll be all right. Jesus, however, had been speaking about his death, but they thought he was merely referring to sleep. There's something there, right? That for Jesus, for God, death and sleep, not very different. Pretty much the same thing. Then Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus is dead. For your sake, I'm glad I was not there, so that you may believe, but let us go to him. Thomas, who is called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, let us also go, that we may die with him. When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, some 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, while Mary stayed at home. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, I know that he'll rise again in the resurrection on the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Right? Just that's central to our funeral services, right? I mean, if you've been to any funerals that I've done or that Pastor Gretchen's done, I mean, that's central to what we believe, right? That in Jesus we won't die, that we'll pass from one room of God's house to another. Right? She said to him, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world. And when she'd said this, she went back and called her sister Mary and told her privately, the teacher is here and is calling for you. And when she heard it, she got up quickly and went to him. Now, Jesus had not yet come to the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. The Jews who were with her in the house consoling her saw Mary get up quickly and go out. They followed her because they thought she was going to the tomb to weep there. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, where have you laid him? They said to him, Lord, come and see. Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, see how he loved him. But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was laying against it. Jesus said, take away the stone. Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, Lord, already there is a stench, because he's been dead 4 days. Jesus said to her, did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? So they took away the stone, and Jesus looked upward and said, Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I've said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me. And when he said this, he cried out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, his face wrapped in a cloth, Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." Okay, so, I mean, there's just so much here that you might want to talk about. The 4-day thing is pretty important. Our Jewish neighbors believed in this time that when a person died, their soul, their spirit would hover around the dead body for 4 days, looking for a way back in, looking for a way to reanimate that dead body. But after 4 days, the level of decay was such that the soul would go to God, right? Would go to the place of the dead. So it's important that this is 4 days, because Jesus is calling someone back from the next room back into the kitchen, right? This is not someone who is on the threshold, who still has 1 foot in each of the rooms, right? So Jesus has the power, the authority to bring people back. He knows that he's going to bring them back, that he's going to bring Lazarus back. There's something really cool here about Jesus' emotionality that he said right at the top of this story that everything's going to be okay, that Lazarus, is that this is all to God's glory, that what's happening to Lazarus is God's glory. But Jesus is aware that it has caused tremendous pain to these sisters and to Lazarus's friends, and he's deeply moved by that, right? I mean, he's not just, hey, what are you worried about? It's all going to be fine. There's none of that in Jesus. There's this great tenderness, this great strength, this great presence. And again, an indication that he is the God of the living and the dead, that he is in charge of all of the rooms in God's house, and that he can move people between them, right? I mean, if you're looking for some story, something to grab onto to help you understand who Jesus is, these 3 stories aren't such a bad place to start, right? That Jesus is not just a glorified human teacher, right? This is someone with power that most of us can't imagine, that none of us have, but that he has dominion over all the rooms in God's house, right? I hope that metaphor is working for you. If it's not, that should be the first question that you have, right? Or you should go back and listen to the start of this video. Again, the final words of the phrase that pays: his word shall stand forever. His word shall stand forever, and throw a period on that too. Obviously, it's some verses of Martin Luther. Okay, so that'll give us plenty to talk about. There's an awful lot here. Make sure that when you think about Jesus, you think about who he actually is. Don't put together in your mind some tame, pale guy that you think is Jesus. The real Jesus is God, and the real Jesus has the power of life and death. And the real Jesus teaches us about the house of God. So that's good for tonight. You take care. I hope to see you soon, and I hope to hear from you. It's always fun. Bye-bye.